Hi, I'm Martin Stepek, and I am been delighted to do a talk on World Refugee Day about my own family and how the Stepeks came to Scotland. But in preparing for it, my thought was drawn to the fact that crossroads and moments in life where fate or something intervenes and your world changes completely. So the Stepeks and their relations were happily settled in Poland for hundreds of years that we know about, and probably hundreds of years beyond that. And then all of a sudden, something erupts that changes everything. And I grew up in Scotland, born in Scotland, grew up in Scotland, and slowly but surely started to become aware of the influence and the positive perspectives of Italian families, Lithuanian families, Polish families, and Chinese and Indian families, and bringing their cultures. And it struck me that all of those have a story behind them, all of those have crossroad moments. And perhaps through telling and retelling and reconfiguring my own family story and how they ended up in Scotland, we could get a better insight and perspective on how refugees and asylum seekers actually end up here. On the 6th of December 1941, the cattle truck, which the Stepeks had climbed into, was stuck in yet another railway siding. There were hundreds of exhausted Poles crammed inside, hungry and ill. They had few, if any, resources, and their energy was spent. Janina, by this stage of their ordeal, was unable to stand and couldn't walk for more than a few seconds. She was increasingly sick, worn out, and she was starving. The family hadn't eaten for a week and were surviving by melting the snow from the ground and the icicles that formed all day long on their cattle train, these being their only source of water. After several hours of forlorn waiting, another train stopped on the track adjacent. It was filled with Russians fleeing the advancing German forces in the west. The Polish refugees, aching with hunger, ran out to beg from the Russian people on the other train, and many Russians generously shared their food with them. Danka watched this dramatic scene from the open door, which had been slid open by Jan. He and Zosha had gone begging, leaving Danka to look after their mother. But they returned empty-handed, and the whole family sank into a silent desolation. Then Danka thought she heard a word that sounded something like dziewuczka. It was hard to hear among the bustle of Polish beggars and Russians. Again she heard it, only this time much more clearly. A woman's voice. Dziewuczka, Russian for girl. She started to look for the woman, following the direction from which the word came. A Russian woman, wrapped in a thick fur coat and hair and hat, was standing at the door of the other train, almost directly opposite Danka's carriage. Danka stared at her, ready to see what she might be able to beg from this lady, an opportunity to show again what her childlike looks might draw from a stranger. The woman was young, maybe 30 years old, and to Danka's eyes she looked beautiful. She stared back and smiled at Danka. Then, without a word, she delved into a bag at her side and threw something large and heavy straight at her. Instinctively, Danka recoiled, but she caught the object. It was a very large loaf of bread. She looked up to thank the lady, but she had already gone back into the carriage. This loaf fed the family for a week. They had nothing else during that time, and it's likely that without it, they would all have died of hunger. The date was the 6th of December. It's St. Nicholas's Day. It's the day that in some parts of Poland children receive an early Christmas present. Now, I'll start with that because when I was preparing for this, I was thinking, what makes people a refugee? What makes people come to another country? What makes people make these decisions? And I thought that, like all of us in our lives, there are sort of crossroad moments where if you had done that, everything would be different, but you decided to do this and your life went on. And my one is I worked my way around the world for 4 years. But after 3, I came back for a couple of months to earn some more money so I could travel in my sort of vagabond way that I did. And I was at home, and my best friend from university said, "Do you want to go to my party? It's my birthday on Saturday. Do you want to come along?" And I don't like parties. I'm a sociable person, but I like 1 or 2 people. I don't like things. And I said, "No, I'll see you on Monday maybe." And he said, "Oh, come along. Some of the folks from uni, your friends will be there." So he persuaded me to come along. And by chance, my now wife happened to be there. And if I had not gone to that party, everything would be different. You know, absolutely everything. There's a fair chance that for some reason I didn't get round to writing books about my dad, and you wouldn't be here, you'd be doing something else. So everything changes on a decision in a moment. And so I started looking at my family story from that perspective, and I've always felt this affinity to this beautiful Russian woman who, not knowing whether she was going to have enough food or bread in the months to follow, because she's now a refugee in her own country, fleeing the German forces. If she hadn't, then we'd all be doing something different today. I wouldn't exist, because my dad would have been dead at the age of 19. And it's this understanding of what a refugee's plight can be, that sometimes you just get lucky, sometimes you just get unlucky, and the unlucky ones aren't known. I've got a photograph of my grandmother's grave in this booklet if people want to look along later. She was 39 years old and she died of starvation. She didn't manage to make it, and she's buried in Tehran. And I was thinking last night, is her grave still going to be there in Tehran, or is it just going to be a random case of a bomb happens to fall in the wrong place? And all these things are a combination of effort, luck, fate, chance. So I sort of thought of it as a subtitle of Crossroad Moments in Lives. That then brings me back to, how did Dad end up here? Not literally here, but in Hamilton. And that's another wee reading. So he served in the Polish Navy. Long story, we'll get back to that. On the night of the 5th and 6th of June 1944, Danka, in bed in Palestine, had a premonition that Jan was in terrible danger. Unknown to her, the ship he was on, the Slonzak, had just set sail with hundreds of other Allied ships. By morning, they were shelling the beaches of the Normandy coast. D-Day had commenced. Following the invasion of France, Jan's life revolved around repeated journeys across the English Channel to bring further personnel and supplies for the final push through Western Europe towards Germany. There were no major military incidents experienced by Jan during the period. However, his mental health suffered a prolonged collapse. Perhaps it was the absence of major incidents to keep his mind distracted from his feelings that allowed his body time to finally feel the enormity of all he had been through. Whatever the reason, he was hospitalised or sent to what his war records say was a rest home 5 times in a 5-month period between November the 27th, 1944 and April the 30th, 1945. In between times, he trained and qualified as a radar operator in February of that year. Then, just as he recovered, the war ended. On the 8th of May 1945, he was one of millions of Europeans to rejoice when they heard that the Germans had unconditionally surrendered. This was tempered by the fact that the British and American governments, without consulting the Polish government, had agreed to the Soviet Union's annexation of eastern Poland, and that all of Poland would be under Stalin's sphere of influence post-war. To Jan, this meant that the home he was born and brought up in was no longer in Poland, but part of the Soviet Union, and that his homeland was occupied by the country which had taken him and his family to labour camp, leading to the loss of his mother. It was a hard reality for a young man, only 22, and for his younger sisters. Worse news came soon enough. Zosha telegraphed Jan to tell him that she had heard from the two Stepek aunts that Władysław had died almost 3 years earlier of cancer on the 23rd of June 1943, so it's 3 days' time. In despair, Jan broke the sad news to Danka. Father is dead. We have nothing to go home to. Another crossroad moment of he's in the Navy. You don't get a choice, you just get grabbed in the Navy. The war ends and all your hopes there, and then you realise the geopolitics of it have completely changed. And then he's still thinking, but if my dad's alive, we could go back and risk imprisonment, risk execution, because he's alive and he's unwell, and all of a sudden you find that he's actually not alive. So his mother's dead in Iran, his father's dead in Poland, his home is being destroyed, the region he lived in is no longer part of Poland, and the rest of Poland is occupied by the people that put him in a camp in the first place. And it's, what do? You're 22, you've got two younger sisters that you're in touch with. What do they do? And what is their life? And that's another crossroad moment. A bizarre irony, anytime I say Crossroads, I think of the TV programme. That's not what we're talking about here. But that crossroads in your life. And about 4 or 5 years ago now, I got my dad's war records. I had a summary of them before, but I got this 20 pages of amazing detail, including his own handwritten summary of how he got to be where he was, and therefore able to join the Navy. In his own handwriting, it's lovely to see. But one of the things that asks when he was sort of demobbed, or going to be demobbed, is if you're not allowed to stay in Britain, where else would you be able to go? And it listed all the colonies. And so he'd written South Africa, Australia, and I think he had no idea what South Africa was. And we were talking about it earlier. I don't think he was thinking safaris. In Australia, he's a farm boy, age 17 when the war breaks out. I think he just wrote down some stuff. And crossroads moment again. Just think, if that had happened, you guys would be enjoying the sunshine. I would probably never have been born, or a different version of me would have been born, because my mum's still here in Scotland. And maybe if I'd ever written this book, I'd be reading it out to an Australian group of people. Everything changes. But the changes they endured were of such an enormity. And they're plucking at chances and opportunities. So let's go back a few hundred years to before we now have records. We can go back as far as 1700s for both lines of my dad's family. So the Stepeks and the Chupkas. And as far as we know, the Chupkas, there's a city in western Poland called Gliwice that changed hands from, if I remember right, Polish to Austrian to Polish to Prussian to Austrian to German to Polish. So one of those kind of bits, a bit like Berwick multiplied by 10. And I've got 200 years of them living, the Chupkas living in Gliwice. Well-educated people, merchants, traders, know their stuff. Some lawyers in there, some financial people. And despite the political changes, they're adept enough to handle it without feeling the need to flee. And that's the case until about 1910-ish, when, before then and then subsequently, when they are under German occupation, but they're Polish. And they're feeling a bit pressured because there's an awful lot of Germanisation. You know, you're forced to learn German at school. Your Polish is kind of sort of abandoned. Polish ways of thinking and being and literature are suppressed. So they feel, let's move towards Warsaw. It's under Russian control, and after a few years there, they're thinking, oh, this is worse, if, you know, as bad if not worse. So they go down to Austrian-occupied Poland. I mean, the one good thing about the Polish occupation after the 3 partitions, which lasted for over 100 years, is that you could actually go between the 3 occupying powers and say, well, which one's least bad? And they found that the Austrian one was least bad. And that's where they happened to meet the Stepeks, because the Stepeks were already down there farming for about 300-400 years, as far as back as we can tell. And despite those challenges and those issues, the families still feel stable. They feel they're at home, they want to be at home, they don't want to have to move. And then World War I breaks out and everything starts getting incredibly messy. So my grandfather is a brave guy, very radical guy. He's taken up by all the sort of socialism and side of things, and the idea that Poland could regain its independence because of this war. But he gets conscripted into the Austrian army. He's a pharmacist, so he's put into medical, chemical side of it, medical corps, gets captured by the Russians, and there's so many prescient geographical connections here. He's imprisoned in Mariupol, which is one of the places in Ukraine that the Russians have occupied, and he then contracts for the second time in his life TB. This is in 1916, and it's about 6 months before the Russian Revolution, the first revolution, the February Revolution, and so everything's chaotic in the country. The guards, the prison guards, probably aren't getting paid, they're probably hungry, they're getting meagre rations, and here's this blooming Polish guy gets TB. What are we going to do with him? And the amazing thing is, they want to save his life. For whatever reason, they want to try to save his life. Now, if I was Władysław, I don't know if I'd have wanted my life saved, because this isn't a hospital. There is no anaesthetic, and they're going to cut his lung out. So, on that cheery note, give me a second here. Then fate intervened. He fell ill with tuberculosis for the second time in his life. For some reason, the prison camp authorities decided they would operate and see if they could save him. They cut out the infected part of his lung. He was just 21 years old. It's hard to contemplate the conditions in which such an operation was undertaken in a prisoner of war camp in the early part of the 20th century. Yet somehow he survived, perhaps because of his youthful energy, though it left him with physical disabilities for the rest of his life. Still, he had been sentenced to go to Siberia once he recovered, and surely in his weakened state that would kill him off. Władysław managed to avoid this fate in a most extraordinary way. He was now in good terms with the prison guards while recovering from his lung operation. They regularly played cards together to pass the time while the bureaucracy formalised his transfer documents. Władysław was a good card player, and in one game won a lot of money from the guards. But the guards weren't able to pay him, presumably because the Russian government was by this stage struggling to survive. So Władysław suggested they find a way to give him some stay of execution, literally execution, in exchange for the debt they owed him. The guards came up with the following plan. They would send another prisoner to Siberia in Władysław's name. Now, a prisoner in the camp had been sentenced to death for attempting to escape. and was due to be hanged in the days to come. Given the option, this prisoner readily accepted the Siberia sentence, along with Władysław's name, a slight chance of survival being much better than no chance. To cover up the switch in identities, they had to fake a hanging, so that it looked like the man who had tried to escape was in fact hanged. So they took the body of a third prisoner, who had that day died of natural causes, in his cell, and was already in a makeshift wooden coffin. The guards took his body out of the coffin and hanged it on the gallows. Thus, the hanging had taken place. Finally, to complete the circle, the guards had to be seen to bury the coffin with the dead man inside it, but when the coffin was actually lowered in the ground, it contained no corpse, probably just soil, turf and stones. It's just how lucky was it for him to be under the care of somebody that actually cared enough for another person? And how lucky was it of him that he was able to survive an operation? There must have been a lot of vodka put into his mouth to help him go through that. And we know this is a true story because in 1936, the man who was sent to Siberia in his name was released, and he found the Stepeks to say thank you for his life. Man Danka opened the door to that and boom, a stranger. And so it's a lovely story. If I've got time, I can read it later in the book. From the book. So there's a problem here, though, that Władysław managed to get back, and at the end of the First World War, the Austrian Empire is collapsing, the German Empire is collapsing, and the Russian Empire is now Bolshevik, and it's got its own civil war going on. So the Poles rise up and grab back their homeland, which had been last independent in 1795, so 123 years of occupation. And Władysław is all charged up again, and he's saying, I can help preserve the borders. So he volunteers with 100 folk in the village to help secure the borders against both Bolshevik Russia and the Ukrainians who, like now, were wanting their independence. So it's just repeated history. As a result of his bravery in that, the new Polish government give him land in what's now Western Ukraine. And so they decide to go there. And that's another big crossroads moment, because 20 odd years later, the Second World War breaks out and Germany invades from the west, Soviet Union invade from the east. And if they had stayed in Hatchów, where the Stepeks originally came from, they would be under Nazi occupation. Now, not saying that's a good thing, but where they had moved to, was now under Russian occupation or Soviet occupation. And what we do know is the truth, which is the Soviets came in and tried to find Władysław, my grandfather, to execute him because they thought he would be a resistance leader. They had all the lists of names from spies. So he is to flee into hiding back to Hatchów, back to Nazi-occupied Poland. And you're thinking, you talk about sort of devil in the deep blue sea thing. And while he's away, the rest of the family are taken cattle trains and deported. Takes them 3 weeks to get to the camp, the labour camp, which is in the Arctic Circle. And then there's that looking back, the crossroads moment. What would have happened if they had just stayed where they were? We've got a letter from my grandfather contemplating this. He's written a letter to the ambassador, the Polish ambassador, the German ambassador in Moscow, and he says, I served in the Austrian army, i.e. I'm one of you guys, which he actually wasn't, but he was saying, I'm one of you guys. This has happened to my family. Can you intervene and get my family back, please? And then he talks it over with the sister. So we've got a handwritten and a typed up version of this in German. And he talks it over with his two sisters, and he comes to the conclusion is it's just going to put a spotlight on them. It can make things worse. Sometimes it's better to do nothing. So he has to make this decision as a father to just let things be, which must have been heartbreaking for him. And I spoke to my dad and my aunts about this, and they said, you don't know what could have happened. He said, Dad would almost certainly have been conscripted into the German army. The girls, who knows what would happen to them under Nazi occupation. So again, it's one of those, what would have happened if, as it happened, my dad found himself in another country for the first time in his life, not voluntarily. And just bear with me a second. So at this point then, you've got two branches of a family, Chupkas and Stepeks, who'd been living happily settled in a turbulent area for hundreds of years without feeling the need, that's okay, to rush, and go anywhere. And now they're under occupation, and all the families are being affected by either German occupation or Russian occupation. I worked out that 16 of the 32 direct relatives that my father had either died or were imprisoned in concentration camps in that period. So 50% of them in the space of 5 years. And my Danka told me that Poland's population went down from 36 million to 24 million in a 5-year period. 6 million dead, 6 million dispersed throughout the world. So, bear with me. So this is what happened with Władysław. It took until the 17th of September 1939 for the Soviet armed forces to invade eastern Poland. All its remaining forces, Poland's forces, were engaged in a desperate struggle to hold on to whatever areas remained in Poland's hands. When the Red Army marched in, they were virtually unimpeded, and Poland's fate was sealed. That day, the first Soviet troops entered the farmlands in and around Maćkovci, where the family came from, along with NKVD officers. These were the precursor to the KGB and were the Soviet Union's internal security force, a dreaded secret police. The Stepek family awaited the actions of the invading army with apprehension. They weren't to wait long. That evening, a Jewish friend of Władysław turned up at the door of their farmhouse. I've heard that you're to be arrested and immediately shot. They have a list of potential troublemakers, those who may lead local resistance. You're one of two in this district. As Władysław considered what options they had, a Ukrainian friend appeared at the door. Władysław, they're coming for you within the hour. They'll take you out and they'll kill you without a trial, without any formalities. You need to leave right now. I'll take you across to the German side, to the nearest train station, and then you can think where you might be safest. Janina urged him to go, so reluctantly he left his family and set off for the newly imposed German-Russian border in his friend's cart, both of them hiding rifles under their blankets on their lap. He told Janina he would aim for Harchov. On the way, they passed a village where a young Ukrainian communist recognised Władysław and knew he was one of those targeted. He took out his rifle and prepared to shoot Władysław, but the boy's mother intervened, begging her son not to kill him, so he relented. There were no further incidents before arriving at the tiny train station where Władysław said his thanks and goodbye to his friend. But on the way home, the Ukrainian friend was stopped and he was arrested for helping Władysław escape. Again, it's these, you make a decision, the courage it took, because both obviously the Jewish person and the Ukrainian person were both communists. They were in at the meetings and they were hearing this thinking, that's my friend, we need to do something about it. And the Ukrainian person actually was imprisoned. We found that out later. And he managed to escape. And one of my dad's friends from childhood, who then came to Scotland, Władysław, Vladek Vashko, met this guy in Egypt during the war, late in the war, 1944, and he just knew him because, you know, they grew up together. And he said, "How did you get here?" Because that's all the Polish people, if they met other people from the area, I said, "How did you get here?" And he told them that he was the person that helped my grandfather escape death. And then he was arrested and managed to escape. These stories, it makes me keep thinking of the situation over the years in Syria, Somalia, Libya, Gaza, you know, everywhere just now, Iran just now, people just fleeing, people being oppressed, people being shot, people being killed, people dying of hunger, people dying at sea, whatever. And it's a different perspective when you look at it from your own family's perspective rather than the Daily Mail or the newspapers' views about foreigners and migrants and stuff. So we get lucky. It's bizarre. You get lucky because the Germans renege on their deal with the Soviet Union and invade it in June 1941. You think, well, that's going to make everything worse. But from the Polish point of view, being stuck in a labour camp in the Arctic, they're now freed because all of a sudden the Soviet Union and Poland are allies, whereas like 3 days before they were enemies. It's so crazy. But of course, there's no mobile phones in these days, so, and Russia's a big place. So actually telling people that there's been a decision made to free the people, Polish people in the camps, takes months. So the decision was made in late June, July. Stalin, General Sikorski of Poland and Churchill agreed that, because they knew that hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million, Poles had been deported, including some of their top officers. And they hadn't heard of from these top officers for a year. So they were wanting them all released to help join the armies and fight. But it took a long time to get up to the Arctic to actually tell people. So it was September before the Stepeks found out that they were free to go. And they were treated well in the camp. It wasn't like a lot of the camps in the Soviet Union and certainly in Nazi Germany. It wasn't sadistic. The guard, the commander, was Ukrainian, and he had been through it all himself, and there was a certain degree of kindness that he could afford. But they were all massively underweight. Everybody had been sick. One family had 14 children, and the husband died, and all 14 children died in the camp. So it was rife with disease and malnutrition. And then that's when the bread was given. There took 4 months to get from their camp to Kazakhstan, and halfway through that period they're in this part and they're begging for bread, and the woman gives them the bread. So that flows, and then they're stuck in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan border. And my grandmother is almost gone by this stage, but they're still hoping kind of for a miracle. And Dad finds out that the Polish army are trying to recruit people who are well enough. Now, he could put his hand around his thigh and touch his finger, so he wasn't exactly well. So he had no muscles left. But he found this out, that they were nearby, and he said to his mother, "What do I do? Do I stay with you, or do I try and find out this place and join the Polish army?" And she said, go, whatever happens to us happens. You've got a duty to do. And so he walked off. Again, no Google Maps, no nothing. He's sitting there in a communal farm, basically desperate refugees, and somebody says that to the west. So he gets up and he starts walking to the west. Kazakhstan's big, Uzbekistan's big, you know. And he finds the place, and so he recruits, but he never sees his mother alive again. It's just, these moments. So they get shipped in 3 separate boats. So the 2 girls on one boat, their mother on another boat, and my dad on another boat, all in August 1942. So they've been waiting for 6 months for something to happen to help them, and they can't do anything by themselves. I never really thought about it until recently, but that's your boat, people, that's your small boats, except there's 2,000 people crammed in each of these boats, and some of the boats sink and it's gone, and there's no registrations of names, so people, ancestors, so descendants don't know how certain lots of people died, where they died, but they get across, and all of them are so unwell that they're taken to different, I was going to say specialist units, but you're talking tents strung out across the coast of the Caspian Sea, and they're in Persia now, but they're free. They're now liberated, and Persia's under British rule and Russian rule, but the Britons are kind of running it. But Yanina is taken to a hospital in Tehran, and she dies. She's buried in Tehran. Danka and Zosha slowly recover, not fully recover, but slowly recover well enough to be taken to Palestine. You think, just now you're talking about Iran and Palestine, you think, oh, why is this still going on? So they're taken by truck, obviously. 2 sick girls taken by truck overland. I reckon it's about 3 days, and it's just, ugh, can imagine what it would be like. Dad recovers eventually, so he's had typhus in Kazakhstan, then he gets dysentery on the boat, then he gets dysentery in the north coast of Tehran, and he's taken by a sort of ambulance truck to Tehran where he catches malaria, and he recovers from all of that, and he didn't know his mother had died, but the sisters find him and tell him, and then he's back to the army that had recruited him sort of almost a year earlier, and he it's in Iraq, so he's in Basra, another nice place to remember. Take off all the bad places you've heard the last 10 years. And then he gets ill again. He doesn't know what, but he knows it's tropical disease, and he says, I have to get out of the tropics, I have to get out of this Middle East. So he hears that the Polish Navy are recruiting, and so he goes, and he, after a few dodgy questions, he manages to get permission to join the Polish Navy. This is a guy who hadn't seen a sea until the Caspian Sea, which isn't really inland sea, and now he's in the Navy, and he goes from the Middle East all down through all of Africa, down past South Africa, back up, and he hits a place called Liverpool. And it's February 1943, it's dark, it's cold, it's windy, it's wet, it's Second World War, everything's coal, everything's sort of blackened buildings. And he's thinking, oh God, this is the British Empire, you know? And he grew up on a farm, with sort of orchards and everything like that. And but that's him now in Britain. He didn't ask to be sent to Britain. It just happened that the Polish Navy was near sort of Plymouth, Portsmouth, that sort of area. And now he's in Britain, without choice, without thinking about it. He's just a pawn in this big story. And then, obviously, I mentioned the story about D-Day happens. So he's there. Meanwhile, my Aunt Danka and my Aunt Zosha, who were in Persia, Iran, Danka was weighed, she just turned 15, so they put her in a men's uniform because there was nothing else rather than her rags. And in the uniform, she weighed 3 stone 12, age of 15, so 25 kilograms. She lived to 92. You know, you think, something in the genes, I hope, that's sort of passed on down here, you know. But that tremendous spirit was there. So, just sort of wrapping up the story in loose ends. So Dad serves in the Polish Navy and can't go back because his father's dead and Poland's occupied. And so he decides he's given permission to stay in Britain rather than Australia and New Zealand. And he's told that there are now grants available to study. And his agricultural studies had been broken by the war. But he's thinking, he was an ambitious young guy, Dad, thinking, I could study physics. So he applies to study physics. I think it was at Cambridge. And they say, no, you're Polish, you've been in the Soviet Union, there's a Cold War going on here, there's now an atom bomb, we don't trust you. Quite rightly, you know. And Dad had been forced to sign a loyalty to the Soviet Union thing. If he wanted the bread, he had to sign it. If he didn't want the bread, they would shoot him. You know, take your choice. And he always lived, not in obvious fear, but I think in the back of his mind, he always like, they could come one day. Mr. Stepek, you know, I hear your aunts in Poland, I hear they're well, but they're getting old. The whole threat thing coming through. So that's Dad in his scenario of can't study physics. He's trained as a radar operator, so a friend tells him there's another course. And at this point, he's depressed and he just signs the course, doesn't know where it is, doesn't know what it is for. He's saying, it's a chance, this is the opportunist in him, saying, I can stay in this country if I get to study. And it happened to be Radio and Television College, which is now part of Strathclyde Uni in Glasgow. And it's just luck. He's a radar operator, he knows how to repair radar. Radar and radio, I'm told, is virtually the same thing. And he's able to do this course studying a subject that he already knows. And he's fired off to Glasgow on a train. He'd been in Scotland once before for training in Kirkcaldy. But you can imagine somebody who'd never learned any English going to Fife and trying to understand Fife. Well, he goes to Glasgow this time, 1946, and it's Freshers' Day at the universities. So he lands in Glasgow Central Station, and everybody's out with makeup on and disguises and sort of clinging cans and things. And my dad said it was like a lunatic asylum, you know. So he then goes, and his digs were in Hill Street near the art school, and that's him in Scotland. Not through choice, but very grateful that he's now able to create stability. Zosha, meanwhile, has learned English really well, and she becomes an interpreter at the end of the war. So she interprets once with General Montgomery and the other allies, the Polish allies in Africa. And Danka is sent to Palestine, and she's seriously unwell, seriously unwell, in the sort of yo-yo effect. And she wants to stay the rest of her life in Palestine. She said the people were so friendly, it was warm, it was a beautiful country. And then 1947-48 happens, and there's the mandate creating Israel and Palestine, war still going on, and the Poles are evacuated in late 47, early 48 to Liverpool. Also, Danka's now in the same country as her brother, and shortly afterwards, Zosha just goes because she can get there to be with her family. And that's how the Stepeks came to Britain and how Dad came to Scotland. And you stop and think, everything about it's improbable. Everything about it is such a range between unbelievably painful tragedy and unbelievable kindness of strangers. And you're this cork bobbing in an ocean. And yet you end up here. And so the Stepeks have been here since 1946. You know, that's going to be, what, 80 years next year. And Dad made use of his time. Hamilton Accies would not exist or have to be recreated if it wasn't for my father. He saved them there. Glasgow University had Slavonic studies and studies of Eastern European culture, and they were going to stop it, and my dad intervened and kept it going. We had 350 people employed here in our family business, you know, and that's the result of all this stuff. So I'll leave it at that just now. Well, just double check my notes and make sure I can leave it at that. Yeah, that wasn't bad from memory. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions. The way I've structured this, insofar as I have structured it, there might be some gaps that you might say, well, what happened between there? Yeah. So I'm happy to answer any questions at all. I've also got lots of photographs and stuff that people can, if you want to linger afterwards, and have a look at them, including my grandmother's grave and the uncanny likeness I have for my father, whose uncanny likeness to his father, and my son looks like me. So, but thank you. Take care.